Hello, everyone. So, welcome to the first chapter of Bus 201 Business Communication. So, in the first chapter, we're going to give you an overview of what is communication, uh, the methods of communication, and the communication process in general. So, let's get started. So, effective communication, why is it important? It's important because of a number of reasons. It gives rise to improved stakeholder response, enhances your company's professional image. It gives rise to clearer promotional materials. It fosters and builds strong business relationships, gives rise to steadier workflow, increased productivity, stronger decision making, and quicker problem solving. Now, a lot of these points are self-explanatory. So let's move on to the next slide. Now, before we go into the basics of business communication, these are some macroeconomic issues which we need to address, which we need to understand before we understand what communication is. The workplace nowadays is changing. It's constantly in a state of flux. It's changing in terms of technology, which is always changing. And because of advancing technology, the methods and ways of communicating are also changing. Previously, there was only letters and other hard materials. Nowadays, there are a lot of other communication formats, such as emails and all the other electronic methods. The same goes for the information age. It's very connected with the first point, advancing technology. The third point, globalization, is affecting communication. How is it affecting communication? Well, because of globalization, which basically stands for falling boundaries and the whole world becoming more and more interconnected. So this has given rise to an increased need for effective communication. Since nowadays in companies and in organizations, you're going to see a lot of multicultural people, people from different races, different backgrounds. This requires cultural sensitivity to be able to know how to interact with people from a diverse background. This has happened as a result of globalization. So we can say that globalization has led to workforce diversity. And lastly, team-based organizations. Nowadays, a lot of work in organizations is team-based. Rarely do people work alone. Yeah, there are individual workers, researchers, and so on, but a lot of the work is team-based. And whenever you're working in a team, it puts more emphasis on effective and efficient business communication. So this is an important slide to understand because it talks about the communication process. There are 6 phases, as you can see here. The first phase is where the sender has an idea. Now, obviously, the communication has to start somewhere. In phase 1, it might be brainstorming. You have an idea. I want to say something to another party. That's phase 1. Then in phase 2, I have to encode the idea. And that encoding can be done in a number of methods. If it's an email, my encoding would be typing it in my email software. If it's a letter, it would be writing it with a pen manually. In phase 3, I transmit the message. Now that also depends on my method of delivery. If it's a hard copy letter, you just hand it in, drop it. If it's an email, you click send. It transmits electronically. If it's something else, then that will be different. Now, the channel conveys the message to the receiver. It might be electronic, it might be hard copy letter where you just drop it, or if you're just talking with someone face to face, the channel, the medium is just air. There's nothing. You're just talking to that other person. The information flows through air. The receiver gets the message, and in phase 5, the receiver decodes the message. Now, this is important because the decoding of the message depends upon the frame of reference of the receiver. Everyone has a different frame of reference based on their background, previous knowledge about the topic, general knowledge, culture, and so on. So everyone will interpret something differently. It might be the same thing, but people might interpret it differently based on their frame of reference. Now, in phase 6, the receiver sends feedback back to the sender or whoever sent the message. Now, this completes the communication process, but obviously, phase 6 might not happen all the time. If it is a one-way communication where you just understand the message, then the communications process stops at phase 5. You don't have to send a feedback. It's not mandatory. But sometimes you might. Now, how do we improve business communication? Ethics is a word which you're going to hear a lot. So commit to ethical communication. Adopt an audience-centered approach. Whenever we're communicating, it's important to put yourself in the shoes of the receiver. How would that person or that party feel if they were hearing this message? Use this feeling to better frame and tailor your message. Develop intercultural sensitivity. And finally, improve workplace sensitivity. Now, there's going to be a lot of occasions where you're facing an ethical dilemma or when you're suffering from an ethical lapse. An ethical dilemma is when you're confused, unsure about what to do. You have alternatives, options which are unclear or ambiguous, and you're not sure which option you want to take or which you should take. That's an ethical dilemma. An ethical lapse, on the other hand, is a mistake. It's an ethical mistake when sometimes the choices that you've made are illegal or unethical. So we need to avoid or minimize our ethical lapses to result in efficient and effective communication. So whenever you're making ethical choices, this is a good short list to keep in mind, which will help you make the right and ethical decision. First of all, is the message legal? Obviously, it has to be legal, first of all, before it can be anything else. Is the message balanced? Meaning, is it fair to all? Can you live with this message? How do you feel saying or communicating this message? And is the message feasible? So if it passes all the 4 points, if you can check all the 4 points, then your choice is ethical. Now, like I said before, adopting an audience-centered approach is key. Whenever you're communicating, the communicator has to know about the biases, the education, the age, the status, and style of the audience. All these 5 factors of the audience you need to know about. Are they suffering from any biases? For example, has there been any negative rumor about what you're saying? Are there any preconceived notions? Second of all, their education level. That is obviously a factor. If you're communicating to a low education audience, then your message can be different. If you're communicating to a high education audience, then your message can be a lot more complex, and you can use a lot of subtle cues. Now that goes hand in hand with age, which corresponds to maturity. Just think about, a teacher taking a primary level school class versus a teacher taking a university class. Obviously, the communication format, the style, everything is different based on these factors, right? The age, education level of the audience, the status, and the style. So these are factors you need to consider before communicating. Improving intercultural sensitivity. So first of all, recognize cultural differences. Know that everyone is not the same. People are unique. And everyone has unique traits. Overcoming ethnocentrism. Now, what is this word, ethnocentrism? Ethnocentrism is a belief that your way of doing things, the way that you do things, is the only way or is the superior way of doing things. When you believe that, you are superior. It's very similar to racism, and the key thing is that we need to, whenever we're communicating, we need to overcome this belief. Polish your written intercultural skills and develop strong oral communication skills. Doing all these can improve your intercultural sensitivity. So cultures can vary in terms of context, ethics, their social norms or customs, and the nonverbal communication or body language. Now, whenever we're talking about cultural context, there are two broad types of cultural context: high context cultures and low context cultures. We will talk about this more in detail, but basically, in short, a high context culture is a culture where there's a lot of implied knowledge. People have strong relationships, long-term relationships over a lot of years, and there's a lot of inner codes, body language, norms, ways of doing things. Whereas a low context culture is a culture based on rules, principles, where there are shorter, more professional connections, like an office environment. An example of a high context culture would be a gathering of high school friends, where everyone knows about the other person's habits, traits, etc. So these two cultural contexts differs in terms of decision-making practices, problem-solving styles, and negotiating patterns. We will talk about this more in detail later. So whenever you're communicating across a diverse background, it's important to seek mutual ground, withhold judgment, send honest messages, and respect cultural differences. These are standard practices which enhance your ability to communicate.